We get on our YouTube page. Make sure we have sound. I had it. It didn't record any sound on Thursday night. Yeah. And I don't know why. Because me and technology don't get along. That's pretty much why. All right, we'll get started. 1 Samuel chapter 16. Hopefully we'll cover 16 and 17 tonight. So last we had left off, Saul has been rejected by God as king, and he's going to appoint a new king to take his place. We good? Okay, thank you. So let's read verse 1 through 5. Somebody can do that.
Now the Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you mourn for Saul, seeing I have rejected him from reigning over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided myself a king among his sons." And Samuel said, "How can I go? If Saul hears it, he will kill me." But the Lord said, "Take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Then invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I name to you." So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice.
Okay, so Samuel is in mourning over the fact that God has removed Saul as king. We know Saul, he is still the king, obviously, but in the eyes of the Lord, he's already replaced him. That's not going to take place for a long time. Saul's death doesn't occur till the end of this book. And so, but in the interim, in the meantime, Samuel's really upset because of the situation. It's funny. Even Samuel knew most likely where Saul's kingship was going to go, right? He had given the people warnings about what an earthly king would be like. But he's sad that he was right. He's sad that it came to be this way. He's really sad for Saul and his decisions. And he's in such great remorse and sorrow over this. The Lord kind of picks him up, and wants him to get over this rut. We got work to do. We've got to get the new king anointed, and he doesn't really give him time to grieve. What's the problem though with anointing a new king? Saul's still king. That's right. So is he going to be able to go do this openly? No, it's going to have to be kind of a private hush-hush type of thing. You're not going to be, this isn't going to be on the, front of the Jerusalem Journal tomorrow morning. I mean, it's going to be private, right? In how God works his plan. And what is God's plan here? How's this anointing going to happen?
I mean, God's going to show him when he meets with Jesse.
Yeah.
He's going to show Samuel.
Yeah, so God says, invite Jesse to a sacrifice. Now, God's formulating a plan here. How are we going to get this anointing without Saul taking notice? Saul's going to pay attention to where Samuel is. He's going to hear about it. Samuel is the prophet in this time. So if Samuel goes out, he just told Saul, "You're not the king anymore." He's going to be paying attention to see who Samuel may try to anoint next. And then we know what Saul's like. What would he do with the next anointed king? They try to have him killed. All right. And we know he's going to anoint. Did you notice there in verse 2? verse 1. What does God tell him to fill up and take with him? Why a horn and oil?
Do that anointing like he did with Saul.
Exactly. If you drop down and look at verse 13, it says, so Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. That's what the horn and oil was for. And when God told him to grab it, he knew he was setting off not to just do a sacrifice in Bethlehem with Jesse and his household, but so that he could find the next king and anoint them. He's fine. So Samuel goes to Bethlehem. And what is the response of his unannounced arrival? Why fear?
I guess he could have been bringing herbs.
Yeah. Sorry, Dennis, but if the cops show up, what are we thinking right now?
No good. Keep going.
Yeah, right. Sorry. That's why they like firemen so much. Usually when you see us, it's not going to end in a ticket. I'm sorry. I got to pick on Dennis sometimes. But that's the case with the prophet. He shows up, and is a prophet always just around whenever somebody's doing bad things? No. But that's the way that they had grown to see a prophet.
Well, they had just seen him. Well, they probably heard of him hacking King
Agag. Yeah.
to pieces.
Yeah.
They didn't want to get hacked to pieces.
Yeah. Samuel always seemed to turn up whenever Saul had just done something bad too. The prophets always somehow know. So they're kind of scared. They tremble, and they ask, "Do you come in peace?" And he says, "In peace." And he's come to bring Jesse and his family to sacrifice. Comments, questions about that? You kind of see the plan that God has here.
Well, I like the wording that says, "I have provided me a king."
Yeah.
Among his sons.
Yeah.
They provided him, not the people, but him.
Yeah.
God a king.
Yeah. You are to anoint for me the one I indicate to you. So the Lord directed. So Samuel did what the Lord directed and went to Bethlehem. Yeah. God's in control. Anything else? Let's look at 6-13.
So it was when they come that he looked at Eliab and said, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Then Jesse made Shema pass by, and he said, neither has the Lord chosen this one. Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen these. Samuel said to Jesse, are all the young men here? Then he said, there remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep. And Samuel said to Jesse, send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here. So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy with bright eyes and good looking. And the Lord said, arise, anoint him, for this is the Lord. Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah.
Okay, so Samuel knows he's supposed to anoint a son of Jesse as king. He gets there with Jesse, and he doesn't know which son, though. Jesse's got 8 sons, right? It could be any one of them. And in fact, 7 are all there. And, I might think Samuel's looking at the bunch and thinking, yeah, probably one of these guys here. They're all of adult age. Some of them have been in battle. We'll read in the next chapter, they were going out and fighting with Saul and his army. So they're already military age, probably men of valor somewhat. And so Samuel's thinking, okay, here we got something. And which son does Samuel think it is that's going to be the king? I'm sorry, Jesse. I said Samuel. I meant Jesse.
Abinadab?
Yeah.
Or the Eliab?
Yeah, Eliab, right? Oldest born. You would think the oldest born would be the king, right? Present that one first. This must be the guy you're looking for, Samuel. He's my oldest boy. You know, I'm real proud of him. And Samuel says, no, not him. And so naturally, what do you do as the parent? All right, bring Abinadab in here. He's next oldest. It must be him. Well, I'll talk to you later, Eliab. I don't. You've done something that's displeased the prophet. And Samuel says, no, it's not him. Hasn't chosen this one either. And so Jesse then presents Shemaiah. But Samuel says, no, the Lord hasn't chosen this one either. And he goes through all 7 sons. And Samuel tells Jesse, the Lord hasn't chosen any of these in verse 10. Samuel asked him, are all these the sons that you have? And Jesse says, well, there's my youngest. But I didn't even bring him here today because I didn't figure it could possibly be him. And he's way out in the field tending to the sheep. And Samuel says, bring him here. Nobody there believed that David was the person that he was looking for, would be fit to be this king. And David's just the least likely. And what's David look like when he brings him in?
Ready.
Yeah. Ruddy. What else? Okay. Yeah. What's significant about that, you think? Why tell us that?
He was energetic. Sounds like he was energetic.
Okay, yeah. Young man. Yeah. Maybe a testimony to his youth. When you think of a king who is a warrior king, a king to lead the battles and lead the army, you think about the pretty boy?
You think of a rough looking stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. A rough guy that's maybe got some experience on him, right? You don't think about Daniel, or David, rather. You don't think about him. And so I think that's why we're being told this, right? He does not fit the image at all of what they wanted in a king or what you think would be a king. He doesn't fit that, especially at this point in his life.
Well, most of our presidents for a while were war heroes.
Yeah.
Not all of them, but for a while.
Yeah.
John F. Kennedy was, and all the others.
Yeah. Yeah. From George Washington on for a while. Yeah. And then after World War II, you know, yeah. Been a lot different here in the past few decades for us. Yeah. And so, you know, think about another thing. Where is David when he's called to be king? Doing what? Where was Saul when he was called to be king?
He was looking for
donkeys, right?
Yeah.
Wasn't Saul kind of like a wandering donkey himself? And David like a pastor of God's flock? Interesting to kind of see how that's the case for both these men there. Maybe like a what do you call that? Foreshadowing, maybe? Comments, questions you guys have? Anything you all saw we didn't talk about?
I didn't know that God had the evil spirit of it out there. He said,
In verse 14? Well, let's talk about, or verse,
verse 43.
yeah. All right, well, let's talk about that. So look at verse 13.
Oh, we're back here.
Yeah, but let's get right into that section since you brought it up. So Samuel took the horn, anointed him, and the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully on David from that day forward. Now, somebody reads 14 to 23.
But the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul, and a distressing spirit from the Lord troubled him. And Saul's servants said to him, surely a distressing spirit from God is troubling you. Let our master now command your servants who are before you to seek out a man who is a skillful player on the harp. And it shall be that he will play it with his hand when the distressing spirit from God is upon you, and you shall be well. So Saul said to his servants, provide me now a man who can play well, and bring him to me. Then one of the servants answered and said, look, I have seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite, who is skillful in play, a mighty man of valor, a man of war, prudent in speech, and a handsome person, and the Lord is with him. Therefore Saul sent messengers to Jesse and said, Send me your son David, who is with the sheep. And Jesse took a donkey loaded with bread, a skin of wine, and a young goat, and sent them by his son David to Saul. So David came to Saul and stood before him, and he loved him greatly, and he became his armor bearer. And Saul sent to Jesse, saying, Please let David stand before me, for he has found favor in my sight. And so it was, whenever the Spirit from God was upon Saul, that David would take a harp and play it with his hand. Then Saul would become refreshed and well, and the distressing spirit would depart from him.
Okay, so the same Spirit of the Lord that came mightily on David has left Saul. It's interesting to see that. And in its place, God has left an evil spirit on Saul. You know, I don't know what all it did to him and how. I'll tell you this. There's this. It's a TV show. I can't remember who put it out, but it's called the Book of David or the House of David, and we've just watched 2 episodes of it. It actually does a pretty good job if you know the story of 1 Samuel, because they leave a lot of things out, like things that God say, because it's just characters. But they do a really good job with it. And one of the things that they are showing in that is this evil spirit on Saul. Now, you don't see any type of like a ghost or anything like that, but you see how Saul acts, and he's very paranoid. And it's almost like he becomes a different person, you know, almost like split personality. And, you know, I don't know exactly, but we know that it, you know, bouts of paranoia, maybe even depression, because he knows that the Lord is taking away. He's paranoid about somebody usurping him and his throne and taking the kingship away from him. And he gets angry and has these fits of rage. We're going to see that several more times. And you think about people who struggle with that. What do they do? Or a lot of times, what are some of the tactics they try to help someone through that?
Self-help, like meditation, journaling.
Yeah. Medicines, we know that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But you ever heard music? Have you ever listened to like classical music to calm down?
Music therapy is like a thing out there, you know.
Yeah. It is something that we think, you know, I don't know how much of a placebo effect that it probably has, but they thought the same thing here, and it evidently worked for Saul, right? And so they bring in David to play this music to calm him down and to soothe him.
Happens.
Yeah.
David, you know.
Isn't that ironic?
And it's God control.
Sounds like depression a lot, don't it?
Yeah, it does. It does.
But
And
Saul don't know that David's
No.
is the replacement, does he?
no.
That's just facade.
And we talk about God's hand is in it all. And we get that from stories like this, I think. When we see and look and say, wow, what a coincidence that David's the anointed king and he's playing music for the current king. That's odd. But we know God is placing David where he needs to be. And how God is contrasting 2 individuals right before us. You have one who has chosen wickedness and evil and has this spirit come on him. And you have this other individual who we will later figure out is a man after God's own heart, and God, his spirit is upon him. So a few things about this evil spirit. You may translate this as a spirit of punishment. It's certainly a spirit of negative influence. I definitely think you could take that away in understanding this. You know, the Lord can use negative things to punish us. We see that time and time again. I'm not sure how this spirit operates. We're not told exactly here for Samuel. I don't know what it was, but we can only speculate. I think about 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. He can send a deluding spirit to cause people who believe in something, they can believe what is false. 1 Kings chapter 22, the Lord sent deceiving spirits to the prophets of Ahab. Very similar thing that we see here. He repeats it in 1 Kings 22. God uses these things sometimes on people who are being unrighteous and sinning. Those who are living righteously don't undergo this, right? I see this as a punishment that God has dealt on him. You know, I think about Job. He realizes that God can give blessing and give punishment, and he has that right just as God. And I think about Job's words in that. God did not send this to Saul because he had a clean heart and was working for the Lord. And I think that's an important thing to consider here. God can uplift the humble, but he also brings down the prideful. And so here's something to think about, and then I'll open it up for you all. Here's an example. Saul is kind of like an untreated wound. You know, if you get like a wound, a cut, and maybe you don't cover it with a bandage. Saul's not done anything to cover his broken heart to God. He's not done anything to mend it. And if you keep on going with it uncovered and not treating it with medicines or whatever, salves or bandages, and maybe you keep on injuring it in the same way. You know, I think about a thumb. If you're like hammering a nail, you just keep hitting that thumb, busting that thumb. Is it ever going to get better?
Always the one again.
It is. It is. Maybe we need to switch hands with the hammer. Eventually, the wound will get infected. And I think that's what this spirit is like. It's like an infection now that is set in.
God knew his heart.
That's right. And the idea of this evil influencing spirit being on Saul is kind of like that infection that set in. Now contrast that. When Saul first became king, he was very inadequate for the position. He was largely unknown. He was shy. He was not the brightest, but God equipped him with what he needed to do the job. Once he became disobedient, it caused a spiritual injury between God and Saul. And now that infection is setting in for Saul. That's all that's happened. You know, Saul's made his decisions over and over and over again. Comments, questions?
We kind of do the same thing, but how do we get from getting more infected by, asking forgiveness, I guess?
Yeah, repentance.
We've got to not expose ourselves to sin. You know, if we are struggling with a sin, and I think that's where we're at with this. Saul's struggling with the same sin over and over again. He will not obey God. Right. We might take a sin like alcoholism, for example, right? Well, if we continue to go to bars and exposing ourselves to where there is alcohol, we're setting ourselves up for that. God is not going to step in for us and burn down the bar every time we get out of the parking lot to go in. He's not going to stop us physically from sinning. If we want to sin, we will willfully go in and do that. But yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's our behavior that we
Yeah.
have to change.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything from chapter 16? Y'all didn't ask the question I thought you were going to ask. So we'll just move on. What? All right, what is it, Marina? Oh, I got to tell you the question. Okay. This is something I've been asked before. That's why. Does it seem a little deceptive on God's part at the very beginning of the chapter when he uses this sacrifice to kind of shield and hide the true intent of Samuel's trip to Jesse's house? Because the whole purpose of that is if Saul was to ask, where have you been? Like he will here after a while. Samuel's response is going to be, I went to sacrifice with Jesse. Is that a lie? That's what I've been asked before.
No, well, they did the sacrifice.
They did.
And it seems to have been, David seems to have been anointed without even his brothers really knowing that happened. Because the three oldest, later are following Saul and are sort of chiding him for his, involvement in the Goliath battle. And
Yeah.
they don't even seem to really.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder who knew.
Yeah.
Because it would be hard to keep that secret.
Well, they knew in Bethlehem at least. And then he went on the road, if, him going towards there.
No one knows God's real intent a lot of times,
Yeah.
I
I think two things we can say about it. One is it's never okay to lie. But nowhere are we commanded that we have to give an answer or tell a full story or tale of everything that happened or give a full account of everything. Sometimes it's wise not to in certain circumstances.
It was
It's not.
against for David.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, if you just come out with beginning to end,
Yeah.
he wouldn't have been protected.
The important thing is,
different tales on Matthew, Mark, Luke.
oh yeah, different
There are
accounts.
3 different
Yeah.
accounts.
So it's not like one of them lied, they just gave different
Or
details.
just didn't tell all
Well, they
that.
did that sometimes. They like say 4 people was here, and the next time you find out 2 people was here. But they can both be true.
Yes. Yeah.
You know.
Yep. That's absolutely right. I think sometimes we hem ourselves up into, when we get into things, sometimes, well, I really don't want to tell someone this because it'll hurt them, or, we can make 1,000 what ifs, but whatever it is, we don't want to tell them. Nothing says that we have to even answer whatever that is. And it may be best in some instances for us not to answer, depending on what it is in something. Never lie. We never lie. And we never be deceptive and things like that. But there's a handful of Old Testament things like this that come up that people look at and they,
Well, Jesus rarely answered a question
yeah,
straight out. He usually, ask the question and let them see the answer.
yeah,
Or told a parable and let them figure it out that way.
yep. So the rest is given in parables. What was that? Mark chapter 4. All right. Anything else? Well, let's look at chapter 17. 1 through, it's a lengthy reading, but I want to get it all in. 1 through 16.
Now the Philistines gathered their armies together to battle, and were gathered at Soko, which belongs to Judah. They encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes-Dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and they encamped in the valley of Elah, and drew up in battle array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on a mountain on one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, with a valley between them. And a champion went out from the camp of the Philistines, named Goliath from Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. And he had bronze armor on his legs, and a bronze javelin between his shoulders. Now the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his iron spearhead weighed 600 shekels, and a shield bearer went before him. Then he stood and cried out to the armies of Israel, and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. And the Philistines said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now David was the son of that Ephrathite of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Jesse, and who had 8 sons. And the man was old, advanced in years, in the days of Saul. The 3 oldest sons of Jesse had gone to follow Saul to the battle. The names of his 3 sons who went to the battle were Eliab the firstborn, next to him Abinadab, and the third Shammah. David was the youngest, and the 3 oldest followed Saul. But David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem. And the Philistine drew near and presented himself 40 days, morning and evening. Is that it?
Yep. All right. So we're introduced to some places here, and I won't get too in depth on this, but I couldn't show. There weren't any good high quality maps that I could blow up big enough on, even on that little TV for you. But you understand, there's like a valley in between these 2 armies. You have the Mediterranean Sea here. Let's see. Let me get the Dead Sea down here, and the Galilee Sea up here. I know that's not how you spell Galilee, but you get what I mean. Jericho would have been right in here somewhere, and then I always remember Jerusalem about right here. Now, right now in the news, you can really remember Philistine country right now. Anybody remember the 5 Philistine city-states?
Gath is one of them.
Yeah, Gath. And it's not real important, but one reason why you'll remember that right now is this Gaza Strip, and it had in it all 5 Philistine city-states, and they're right around in here. Now, Bethlehem is due south of Jerusalem and over a piece in between these 2 areas, really. And remember, Bethlehem is where, who is from there?
David.
Yeah, David. Anybody else you guys remember? You ladies ought to know these 2 real well. We're not from there. One of them lived there. The other one was buried there. I'm sorry. Rachel was buried there. And then Ruth went to live there with Naomi. What do all 3 of these people have in common other than Bethlehem?
In the lineage of
Yeah, they're all related,
Jesus.
right? Yeah. In the lineage of Jesus as well. That's right. Just something interesting. So Bethlehem's kind of a big deal. Did you notice that in verse 12, David was the son of the Ephrathite? That's not Ephraim, because David was from the tribe of Judah, right? Ephrathite, if you go back and look in some of the text, Genesis chapter 35. I've got this written down right here. 19. Thank you. And then Ruth 4, chapter 11, or chapter 4, verse 11. This Ephrathite is another word for Bethlehem. I think in Genesis 35 it uses that. And then you can go back and look at some other things. There's 1 or 2 other verses, I think. But anyways, so they're in this battle. And this battle occurs in the valley of Elah. And so basically what happens is there's like a ravine of sorts, and this valley is right here in between them. And you have a couple of these other places mentioned. Soko is mentioned, ancient city, and the other one, Azekah. And I do not remember the origin of Azekah sitting here. Off the cuff, it sounds like Philistine. But anyways, they've got these 2 armies here. And what they decide to do is, instead of fighting, we'll just send our strongest man out. And you all send your strongest man out. And whoever wins that battle, we'll decide this battle and we'll be done. We'll all go home. This was a common thing to see this time, but long time afterward in just regular world history of people doing that and armies doing that. So it's not absurd what they're planning to do here. It's well documented. And so you got Philistines on one hill, the Israelites on the other hill. And who do the Philistines have as their champion? Goliath, yeah. What was Goliath like?
Big,
Yeah, how big?
9 foot 9 inches, the way I understand it.
Yeah. Is a cubit fingertips to the elbow?
It's supposed to be 18 inches, but some people go 24.
18 to 24 inches. That's what I've always heard. That's the measurement that Noah used to build the ark, right? Yeah.
How tall is this ceiling?
Okay, so that's what I was thinking about today, and I meant to measure it. I think it's 9 foot.
6. It's 6 cubits was
Oh no, she was asking how tall the ceiling is.
the ceiling.
Yeah,
Right here.
right here. I think these are 9 foot,
I
aren't
don't
they?
think he could have stood up in there.
Yeah.
Because he was an extra 9 inches.
He'd be
Yeah.
taller.
Span, 9
Big
inches.
boy, wasn't
Do y'all ever see that Ladlow character down there in Pigeon Forge, Gatlinburg, at the Ripley's Museum? There's a fellow named
Tallest man.
Yep, Ladlow, and we've got black and white photos of him. He was 8 foot 9 inches. Had a pituitary gland issue. Died relatively young, I think in his 40s because of it. But not absurd, and that's kind of almost lifelike right there for us to think that. But Goliath was taller than him. Big fella.
But he couldn't walk under the basketball net without hitting the net.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, and some of those players are 7 foot tall, and we think they're,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah.
Were there any other, do we have, I know we have other records of giants in scripture, but I wonder at this time, was he like something of an oddity right here in this time?
We remember when the Israelites came into the land of Canaan, they reported that the people were, Caleb and Joshua and others reported that the men were big. Actually, it was the group that the 10 men said that, the other 12 spies, and they really talked about how big the Canaanites were. I don't know if they were giants. It doesn't say that they were.
Caleb said he'd taken, and they had the sons of
Yeah, that's a good point. I forgot about that.
giants, and Caleb said he'd take them.
That's right. And at the end of the book of Joshua, I forgot about that. Yeah. At the end of Caleb's life, I think he was 80 years old when he said that.
But scientists find in some reasons to believe that there were
Yeah.
giants of that nature.
Yeah.
I never did have to worry about it, but
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a big guy. I mean, he's really big. What's he wearing? This is, I think, an even better testament to how big this guy was. Bronze scale armor, not light, about 125 pounds. About.
The whole helmet of bronze.
Yeah, whole helmet of bronze. What about his javelin? What was that like? 17-pound tip. Need a lot of leverage for a spear like that, for that big. Now, think about that, Goliath. Think back now to chapter 16, verse 7, and what David was like. Yeah, but what we think, and we'll talk a little bit more about it, but don't look at the appearance. I think that's what we need to see in all this. We become so impressed or intimidated by appearance, but that's a determining factor for what's happening here. I mean, you look at these two guys, you got a ruddy little David, doesn't look like he's a match for Goliath. And despite all that, it doesn't matter, right? David's the one who beats Goliath.
I don't think David was full grown for a regular person as it did.
Yeah. Yeah. And so who's willing to go out there and fight Goliath? Nobody. So here comes David from the fields. He comes down to bring food and just figure out how the war is going on. How's the war effort? Talk to his brothers. And, I don't think we've gotten that far, have we?
No.
Yeah, we haven't got that far. And he talks to his 3 oldest brothers. That's what he is. All right, comments, questions about that section. All right, 17 to 30.
Then Jesse said to his son David, "Take now for your brothers an ephah of this dried grain and these 10 loaves, and run to your brothers at the camp. And carry these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers fare, and bring back news of them." Now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things, and went as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. And David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper, ran to the army, and came and greeted his brothers. Then as he talked with them, there was the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, coming up from the armies of the Philistines. And he spoke according to the same words. So David heard them. And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. So the men of Israel said, "Have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel, and it shall be that the man who kills him, the king will enrich with great riches, and will give him his daughter, and give his father's house exemption from taxes in Israel." Then David spoke to the men who stood by him, saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" And the people answered him in this manner, saying, "So shall it be done for the man who kills him." Now Eliab, his oldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was aroused against David, and he said, "Why did you come down here? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the insolence of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." And David said, "What have I done now? Is there not a cause?" Then he turned from him toward another and said the same thing. And these people answered him as the first one. I went to 30.
Okay, thank you. So Jesse sends David out, take this care package, and you never really know what the day's going to bring. You think David set out on this journey thinking he was going to have to slay a giant? Nope, never thought about that, right? So David brings the goods to his brothers. Then Goliath happens to come out with his daily taunt. How long has he been doing this taunt? 40 days. Yeah. To imagine this. That's why I like this house of David. We've only just been introduced to Goliath. They did a pretty good job with him. He's scary. Like, it'll make your bones shake if you were David and experiencing this. I mean, nobody in this army would face this guy. You know, Goliath is just this raw, intimidating figure, and God's people are just shaking. I mean, he is just terrorizing them. And David, he comes out, and David hears his taunts, you know, and what he's saying. And David starts listening to the stories of the soldiers. And the soldiers, what do they say? They start in verse 25. Look how they talk about this predicament that they're in. First of all, they talk more about the reward in verse 25, right? They're talking about this physical reward that they'll get. You know, no taxes. Saul said whoever defeats him, no taxes for that guy. And then they talk about how they talk about Goliath himself. They talk about the man, and they focus on how big and bad he is. And, you know, they say Goliath is defying who?
Living God.
No, they don't. What do they say?
Defy Israel.
Yeah, they say he's defying Israel. I think there's some change that we'll see here. And then number 4, concerning about the man who would kill Goliath. That's all they're focused on there, is all the physical parts of this. The reward, the man Goliath, he's defying this nation of people, and then focusing on who that man will be to do this. Look at David's perspective in verse 26. David talks about the reward and freedom of ridding them of the pagan. He doesn't call him a giant, this pagan Philistine, this guy who's defying, the army of the living God. That's what he's focused on. He calls him, he focuses on this reward and not money or taxes, but he focuses on freedom, right? And oppression. I think this is something that's worth more. It's got more substance than just these taxes. David doesn't care about that. Maybe it's a youth thing. I don't know. Maybe he doesn't care because he's not old enough and smart enough to care.
He's still young enough to be invincible.
Yeah, well, yeah. And, he calls him this uncircumcised Philistine. I think that's important. Right? Because he calls it for what it is. Okay? He looks at this great opposition and he's like, he's just an uncircumcised Philistine. He's against our Lord. He didn't look at him as a man or as a giant or anything like that. He's nothing before God. And he sees more, not defying Israel, but defying God. We talked about that. And that's real important. That's where David's heart seems to be a lot. And then he talks about the man that takes away the reproach from Israel. And I think he's really talking about God there as well. He knows that God is the one who can do these things. It's about perspectives. The perspective of David was going to go out there and fight that giant. But the perspective of all these soldiers was one that crippled them. And they're not going to go out there and fight this battle, even for the Lord. And that's what's got them stopped. It all depends on how you look at things. Depends on your perspective. Nothing, no matter the size of Goliath, this uncircumcised Philistine that's taunting the living God, who does he think he is coming up against God? That's all David thinks about. And, what David saw on that day in Elah was very different than what the soldiers saw. And he's the only one that's talking about these things. And so when he starts asking these questions and saying these things, what does his older brother think? What's Eliab say?
He thinks he came down just to want the man.
Why are you here?
Yeah. He just thought he came down to see some action. Well, it's a good thing David hadn't come down to see some action because he sure didn't get any, did he? They aren't doing anything.
David has some other motivation here too, though.
Why's that? What's that?
The riches, exempt from taxes, given the king's daughter.
Who, David motivated?
David has some motivations here, outside motivations.
He would,
Not just this.
but he doesn't mention them. But they are influential, them being there, sure.
But then later you see where he doesn't even feel worthy to be the king's son-in-law. So I don't know I don't know that he cared so much.
Why is
He doesn't really take credit for having killed
No.
Yeah.
like he did God for the most part.
Why is Eliab upset with David, you think? I mean, we're only speculating, but
He's worried about the sheep at home.
could be.
Questioning about the sheep at home.
I think he's jealous of his confidence.
Right, yeah.
I agree.
Who are you to speak up?
And I see us sometimes, like, we can be like the Israelite soldiers in that
Yeah.
we think a problem is too big for God to solve. And then someone comes in that has a fresh perspective on it.
Or a child.
That prays for something to happen that you think, oh, that's never going to happen,
Yeah.
And it humbles us.
Yeah. I think Eliab's feeling small. This Goliath has put him in his place in an effect. And then David comes out and he's like, well, it's a no-brainer to me. This guy needs to be slayed by an army. All I see is an army here, and you all aren't doing what you're supposed to be doing. He's humiliated. All right. Anything else? Any other comments, questions? $31-40.
Now when the words which David spoke were heard, they reported them to Saul and sent for him. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go by this Philistine. And Saul said to David, you are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he a man of war from his youth. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep his father's sheep, and when a lion or a bear came and took the lamb out of the flock, I went out after it and struck it and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I called it by its beard and struck and killed it. Your servant has killed both lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God. Moreover, David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And Saul said to David, go, and the Lord be with you. So Saul clothed David with his armor and put a bronze helmet on his head. He also clothed him with a coat of mail. David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them. So David took them off. Then he took his staff in his hand, and he chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's bag, and a pouch which he had in his, and his sling was in his hand, and drew near to the Philistine.
Okay, so the words of David reach back to Saul. I think how it had to have been a big rumor, right? Did you hear that kid? That kid said he was going to slay Goliath. I mean, it's a big talk, right? They've already been talking for 40 days about Goliath. Now there's been a big change in the story, right? There's been a new thread. Yeah, that was his volunteer. And it reaches all the way back to Saul. And I don't know if he knew that the volunteer was David and was this ruddy little kid or boy, young man, or not, until he was standing in front of him. You might think he's not. He doesn't know until he's there. And so Saul brings this man, this guy who's saying he can beat Goliath. And what does Saul say when he sees David?
You can do this.
Why not?
You're just a kid. You're a kid.
Yeah. And I love how it says, look how it says about Goliath. You are but a child, David. He has been a warrior since he was a child. Insurmountable odds and opposite people to put up in a fight. I mean, he'll kill you. But how does David defend his ability to fight? What does he say?
Killing the bear and the lion and
Yeah.
that guy helped him kill him.
And is it about the bear or the lion for David?
Said the Lord, took him out of the car of the lion.
Yeah. God has done for me in my past a few great things and blessings. And I know that this too will be just like those times. David draws his faith from that. And he says, this uncircumcised Philistine, he sees it as no better than a brutish animal who's defying the armies of God. If God can give me victory over the lion and the bear, how is Goliath any different? He trusts the Lord to give him victory. And so Saul doesn't really have any other options. What's he finally say? Okay. I think this might be the most absurd part of this whole story, that the king says, okay, this may be a good idea, or we'll try it. I mean, it's wild, right? But Saul isn't eager to go out there himself. He isn't eager to find anybody else or make anybody else. And so he puts his war clothing, his armor on David for war, but that doesn't work. David says, I've not tested it, and David's not able to move around in it. Heard somebody one time maybe make the suggestion that, isn't it interesting Saul picked his own armor to put on David? Because who should have probably been out there fighting Goliath? Saul. And I don't know if there's anything to it. Maybe Saul's trying to, maybe people will think it's me out there. I don't know. And you wouldn't have supposed that. But in the army, who knows? But, it doesn't work. So what's David gather up?
Rocks.
Right. 5 smooth stones, slingshot, not much of a weapon. But, what do you need when the Lord is on your side? Not much more, right? Isn't it funny how all these people are doing what Saul is supposed to be doing? Jonathan, back in chapter 14, we talked about that, fighting Saul's battles with the Philistines. Now David in this chapter. Any questions about that section? Why 5 stones?
What fits in the pouch? I don't know.
It's other questions I've heard people ask before. We've already established that David's relying on God, right? I don't know if maybe David had in his mind that Goliath wasn't the only giant he'd have to slay that day. I think God expects us to do our part, though. Could David have went out there with nothing? Well, sure, with that kind of mental aptitude and what he's talking about, but God expects us to do our part, right? We don't sit back and say, well, I've already prayed to God and he's going to take care of this, and then we don't do anything. I think about that silly cartoon all the time. The guy's stranded on the island and there's boats in, and then there's this, that, and the guy's just sitting there saying, I'm waiting on, God to save me. And then he goes up to heaven and God said, I sent you 5 boats. It's kind of crude, but I think it's that type of thing here. Why did he take 5? I don't know. It only took 1 stone.
Well, it would have been poor judgment to take 1. Anybody could miss.
But if the Lord's on your side, yeah.
If it was also to say, obviously this was God. This was not me. This was not my
That's a good
strength.
point. Yeah.
It's a stone. Of course, it's not going to take down a giant.
Yeah.
I mean, even the best armor and the best weapons that they had at the time wouldn't necessarily take Goliath down.
Yeah.
Or else somebody else would have fought him by then.
Yeah. That's a good point.
So
Yeah.
if it was just a stone that slingshotted at this giant, of course it was God, because it certainly wasn't David.
Yeah.
Yep.
So none of them had tried?
No.
None of Saul's army had tried.
They'd sat there and listened for 40 days. Somebody bragging, I never he wasn't do that.
Same amount of time it took to flood the earth.
Couldn't just sit back, could you?
No, had to do so.
All right, let's read 41 to 54.
So the Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who wore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good looking. So the Philistine said to David, Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Then all this assembly shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. So it was, when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, that David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. How far was I supposed to go?
54.
When David put his hand in his bag and took out a stone, and he slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine, took his sword and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley and to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. Then the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. And David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent.
Okay, thank you. All right, so how does Goliath feel when he sees David walking out here?
And so,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so the giant's already gruff and mad on a regular day. Now David comes up and he's even madder. This gets harder for David every step of the way. I mean, very intimidating, right? Goliath's thinking, what glory is there in this battle, right? He's annoyed almost. Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks? You know, it's interesting euphemism there that he's using. David later will talk about him being a dog himself. Goliath begins to curse David by his gods. Bad move. Do you remember what God told Abraham about this sort of thing? He who curses you, I will curse. You know, also we might think about what was the punishment for cursing God?
death,
By what?
stoning.
By stoning. Interesting, isn't it? So, you know, verse 44. Come here, the Philistine called to David, and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and wild beasts. Oh, and imagine the danger and the terror here. And here's little David. David said to the Philistine, you coming? No, I'm just kidding. But he would have been like that, right? You have this big booming voice, and then you have this little fella. Maybe his voice was cracking and squeaking. Who knows? Like going through puberty. I don't know. You come against me with a sword, spear, and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of the armies, the Lord of armies, the God of the ranks of Israel. You have defied him. How is David so boastful and so not arrogant, but how is he so elevated right now?
A lot of faith.
Yeah, in God. David's not doing this on his own account for any glory or prestige or honor. He's doing this so humbly for the Lord. He's mad and he's there because of what Goliath is saying about his God.
I think when he asked when he got there to his brother, is there not a cause? Is there not a reason we're going to fight him?
Yeah.
Somebody's got to stand up for God, isn't that worthwhile?
Yeah.
He had to be ashamed of his brothers in the battle.
Yeah.
On army for not doing something.
Yep. And, he comes towards him and David strikes him with the stone and Goliath falls flat on his face to the ground. You remember who else had fallen flat on their face just a few chapters back in chapter 5 for defying the armies of the living God? Who? It was an object. Dagon, that false god. And you remember the second time when he fell down, what happened? His head falls off, right? Isn't that what happens to Goliath? This God is gaining the victory over the Philistine giant. Ultimate disgrace to be defeated and slayed by just this Israelite kid. I've always found it interesting in verse 50. I don't know if you heard it when she read it, or maybe you thought about this. David defeated the Philistine with a sling and stone. He overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. David ran and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. What killed Goliath?
Beheading, I guess.
The sword killed him.
But it says
In verse 50, struck the Philistine and killed him.
in 50 it says he struck him and killed him. But then it says he took the sword and killed him.
Evidently, the head was just a trophy then.
Read verse 50 again. David defeated the Philistine giant with a sling and stone. David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword. Did David have a sword when he came out there?
No, he didn't.
No. Where'd he get the sword? He took Goliath's sword. You have to read verse 51. You have to be careful when you read Hebrew literature in chronological alphabetical order. That's not how they told stories even often. The storyline of David is right through these chapters. I couldn't even tell you what order it's in. There's a lot of dispute over that because it does seem that a lot of times things aren't in order. And even down here in this verse here, I think is a pretty good example of that. But it says in verse 51, David ran over and stood over him. He grabbed the Philistine's sword, pulled it from its sheath, and used it to kill him. The stone knocked him out. The sword is what slayed Goliath. I don't have the passage here with me. Later, David will enter the temple, the temple, right? No, it would not have been the temple.
Because when he's running from Saul, he
Yeah.
was carrying Saul,
Goliath's
Goliath's sword with
At-
him.
Was that at Shechem?
I don't know, is that there where those priests were?
It's where the priests were, and he went into the priestly
And he ate
building.
the showbread.
And he ate the short. So he must have been at the tabernacle. That's why I think it's Shechem. Anyways, he took Goliath's sword then, the sword that he had used to kill Goliath. It says it there in that
And
passage.
he took it from the temple, didn't he?
Yeah. Well, the temple's not been built at that time, but temple
I mean,
tabernacle.
took it out of the tabernacle.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Because he didn't have a weapon. He said, "Do you have any weapons here?" The priest says, "No, we don't have any except for the sword of Goliath." And he takes that. So that'll come back up. We're gonna. There's more to tell of that story.
So basically, then you're saying like verse 50, they're telling it and they're concentrating on the stone.
Yeah.
And then in verse 51, they're telling it again and concentrating on
The sword.
the sword. or
The sword.
The actual death.
The actual death. Yeah. I think when it says David overpowered the Philistine and killed him without having a sword, they wanted to show that David walked out without a sword, but the Lord provided a sword that day. It was the sword of the enemy, which is a concept in the prophets as well, the minor prophets. God talks about using their own instruments of war against them and to bring downfall of nations. God can do that. He can show up to a fight with nothing in hand and then use your own weapons against you. It's kind of a neat contrast. But yeah, I take verse 51. That's what I take. That he used the sword to kill Goliath. All right, so verse 55 to 58. We'll finish the chapter and then we'll be done.
When Saul saw David going out against the Philistines, and he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? And Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. So the king said, Inquire whose son this young man is. Then, as David returned from the slaughter of the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul with the head of the Philistine in his hand. And Saul said to him, Whose son are you, young man? So David answered, I'm the son of your servant Jesse, the Bethlehemite.
Okay, so David, goes to come back to Saul, or he comes back to Saul, and what does he bring Saul? The head of Goliath. The very thing he was not expecting. He brings it back to him. It's a symbol of an amazing victory. I think about Saul sending him out there. He didn't even know who David was.
See, that's what I think. This must be what you're talking about the timeline. Because he should have known him because he became his armor
Well,
bearer.
he hadn't
played
started
the
playing
harp.
music yet, had he?
He must not have.
Probably.
Maybe not. Or maybe he didn't know when David, I don't know.
Or maybe he just didn't pay enough attention to his servants or something.
If you were the king, you probably wouldn't.
Yeah, if you were the king, you wouldn't care, yeah.
Some.
Could be either way.
That's why I say the chronology of this text is very difficult to follow. And exactly. I always read this as just facts about David. I just look at it as standalone things, and they're just using it to show who David was.
This paragraph is true for what it says.
Yeah.
Because back in 1715 it says, but David occasionally went and returned from Saul to feed his father's sheep at Bethlehem, and that's why he was back home and then brought the food. So I think he was serving Saul at that time.
We were
Yeah.
talking, me and Nathan were talking, like, if he had a distressing spirit on him, are you gonna pay attention really to other people around you? And
Yeah.
if you're the king, are you gonna pay that close of attention to a harp player?
Was he playing for the king when the king was sick?
Yeah.
The distressing
He might
spirit.
not, he might not have heard anything but the music.
Yeah.
You probably got a lot on your mind as a
In
king.
chapter 16 and 22, it says, Saul sent to Jesse saying, let David, I pray thee, stand before me. So he knew the father. I mean, how else would he?
Yeah.
He's asking the father for David.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
then he's asking whose son.
Yeah.
You know,
And he had just talked to him.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, the chapter before.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. That's why I say I can't find the chronology in it. I don't know exactly, but I almost read this as taking place before that. This story took place before.
Officially
The
became a
lies
harp
took
player.
place
Yeah.
before.
Yeah, but I don't know. We're going to add to this because here in just a little bit, the women are going to start singing David's song about him slaying his 10,000s. But David's shown nothing. There's been no storyline of David doing that yet. And so the chronology gets a little bit more kind of blurred a little bit. Yeah.
Back
So
when
it's hard to tell.
he asked if he could provide a man who could play well. They called David a mighty man of valor, a man of war.
Yeah.
So they would not have called him that yet.
I don't know. That's really
Well, that's certainly not how they viewed David in chapter
Yeah,
17,
right.
right? They viewed him as ruddy and just wanting to come out and look at a fight. Yeah, I don't know. So think about the mission that God has sent us out on as Christians. We face giants that seem overwhelming. We look at the enemy in human terms, or we see them in a spiritual mind. Focus on the power of God. The Lord wins the battle. The end, period. We would do well to remember that. David's story is one I think about a lot. And I think that's why it's in here. I mean, it's a testimony not to David, but a testimony to the Lord. What the Lord can do. It's pretty amazing. All right, that's all I've got for you tonight. I certainly could go on, but I know we're kind of running late tonight, so we'll probably wrap it up. It's 8:00 now. Lord,